I ask unanimous consent to vacate the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to express concern about the budget deal that seems to have been reached that we will vote on later today or tomorrow morning early. I have a concern that a broader concern that we simply aren't cutting spending and that we aren't holding to the budget agreements that we've made. What we're doing here is getting rid of or extending the budget caps on the budget control agreement, spending about $80 billion more than we would have otherwise. Now, we have told ourselves that we have offset this spending. And here's my concern. It's clear that we haven't. Some of the so-called offsets are simple budget gimmicks. Many have been tried and true in the past, such as just extending the sequester a little longer, or one that is of particular concern was raised earlier today. There is in this budget agreement a modest crop insurance savings provision. Now, we have in farm bills over the past few years tried to rein in some of the massive subsidies and waste that has gone on in terms of direct payments and some of the other methods. A lot of that funding has gone toward crop insurance, and it is quite a generous program. In fact, the taxpayer subsidizes crop insurance an average of, I think, just around 70%. 70% of the premium is paid for by the taxpayers. And so what we're doing in this agreement, what we've tried to do in previous farm bills is say the savings, if we reform these programs through so-called standard reinsurance agreements, or SRAs, if we realize some savings, then we plow those savings into the deficit or against the deficit. But what came out of the last farm bill was a provision to say if there are any savings in this program, it has to stay within the program. Now, we don't have that provision, that type of provision, in just about any other program of government, where if you realize some savings by reform, you have to spend those savings on the program itself, just in another way. That doesn't save the taxpayer any money overall. And in this case, we've tried to get that savings, but the farm bill said no, it had to be plowed back into the program. So the reform that was agreed to in this budget deal was to do what we had been trying to do, to make sure that any savings that result from a standard reinsurance agreement be plowed into or be put against the deficit to actually save some money. There was also a small provision which said that it set a target rate for crop insurance companies at 8.9% rather than, I think, the 14.5% that it is currently at. Now, opponents of this deal are saying that this minor change will gut crop insurance. I don't think that is true at all. Crop insurance is far from a suffering industry. It's a significant driver of the cost of our nation's farm program. Government costs for crop insurance have increased substantially over the decade. In fact, after ranging from $2.1 billion to $3.9 billion in FY 2000 to 2007, costs rose to a total of $14.1 billion in FY 12. In FY 13, total program costs were $6.0 billion. In FY 13, $8.7 billion. So, as I mentioned, taxpayers are footing about 70% of the cost of premiums for crop insurance, or 60% of all premiums, 70% of the total costs of the program. This proposed change would not impact the coverage that is received. It would simply trim some of the profits that are there. Some say that that will drive these crop insurance out of the business. I don't think so. There isn't a crisis here. When taxpayers are footing 60 or 70% of the premiums, 70% of the overall cost of the program, it's typically a program that crop insurance of the private sector like to get into. If there is a problem with people fleeing the program, it hasn't been demonstrated. This is not an industry under siege. It's an industry that has seen dramatic expansion and now faces a slight trimming of its profits. And yet we're saying that we can't stand that. And what we're saying is that we're going to undo that deal as part of the budget deal before we even vote on the budget deal. And so earlier today on the floor here, there was an agreement reached with the appropriators in the form of a colloquy that in the omnibus coming up in a couple of weeks, we would remove that provision. And then the savings of some, $4 billion or $8 billion would simply be made up somehow by extending this sequester. Now, this reminds me, Mr. President, of the last budget agreement we had, the Ryan Murray budget, where there was a provision to very slightly adjust the cost of living increase for active duty military retirees. This is something that the military actually asked us to do because they wanted to take a portion of the savings and put it into other areas of the military, but also it would realize a savings for us. This was a small adjustment for just active duty military retirees who retired before the age of 62. If they made it all the way to 62, they could recover all the savings that were there, or the COLA adjustment. But after the agreement, 3 months after the agreement, because of lobbying by one particular small subset of those receiving these benefits, we reversed that change. Just 3 months after we signed the deal, we reversed part of the deal. Now, in this case, what we're doing with the crop insurance program is we aren't even waiting 3 months after the deal. We're not having a separate vote. That vote, by the way, was 97-3 to reverse it, just because of some lobbying against it. I was one of the 3 opposed to reversing the program or the slight cuts. But in this case, with the crop insurance program in this budget deal, we aren't even waiting until the ink is dry. In fact, we aren't even waiting until the ink is applied to the paper signing this deal. We're reversing this change before we even pass the deal. We're agreeing that in the omnibus in a couple of weeks, we're going to reverse these savings. We're going to reverse these offsets. So, Mr. President, I had a lot of problems with this budget deal prior to today, but the more I look at this and the more I learn, I don't know how we can vote for this deal. I don't know how, I don't know when we're going to get serious about our deficit and our overall debt. If we can't do it now, when will we do it? If we can't get serious now, when are we going to get serious? If we have a budget agreement, the BCA now, and we can't stick to it now, what makes us think we're going to in the future? And it makes me think, if we're reversing changes we've made to get some savings before we even have the deal signed, what are we going to do a month after? What are we going to do in the next month? Are there the other provisions that the other offsets or so-called offsets that we're going to address and say, yeah, we didn't really mean it? We're going to reverse that as well. So, Mr. President, it's very discouraging to see what's happening with the budget. We cannot continue to simply spend, and just ignore the real offsets that are needed. I would have been fine with spending additional money on non-defense discretionary if we would be serious about going into entitlement spending, into mandatory spending, and finding real savings, savings that were significant. We have a couple of reaches into mandatory spending, but not significant reaches. And who knows whether they'll last or whether we'll reverse them as well in a couple of months. So this is very discouraging. I will vote against, and I would encourage my colleagues to vote against this agreement as well. And with that, I yield back. And I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk should call the roll.